behind the pulpit. Some men preached salvation while secretly living in sin. They wore the robes of righteousness, but had greed, deceit, and corruption beneath the cross. From scandals of lust and lies to crimes that shattered entire congregations, these pastors turned faith into a tool for manipulation and fame. This is the dark side of the church, where power became poison and the holy became hollow. Welcome to the shocking truth about the 15 most evil black pastors. 1.
The Christian was trying to encourage him.
Reverend James Cleveland, often celebrated as a king of gospel, remains one of the most complex and haunting figures in the history of church music. To many, he was the sound of Sunday mornings, the voice that filled sanctuaries and hearts with hope, revival, and praise. His compositions and arrangements transformed the gospel landscape, giving rise to a new generation of artists who followed his lead. But behind the music and the thunderous applause was a deeply troubled man, struggling with his own inner battles and moral failings that would later cast a shadow on his towering legacy. Throughout the height of his fame, Cleveland's public image was that of a spiritual father, wise, kind, and devoted to nurturing young talent. Many aspiring singers and musicians saw him as a mentor and protector, someone who could open doors in the often closed world of gospel. But beneath the surface of that mentorship, disturbing allegations began to surface. His foster son accused him of sexual abuse that spanned years, an act of deep betrayal that blurred the line between love, trust, and control. It was said that Cleveland used his spiritual authority to manipulate those around him, creating an environment where silence was expected and questioning his actions felt impossible. The tragedy deepened with claims that Reverend Cleveland had contracted HIV and, through the years of abuse, allegedly transmitted the virus to his foster son. This revelation, which came to light after his death in 1991, left the community in shock and disbelief. For many who revered him, it was almost unbearable to reconcile the man who led millions in songs of redemption with the darkness of his private life. His passing from AIDS-related complications not only exposed the stigma surrounding the disease in the black church, but also forced painful conversations about secrecy, sexuality, and accountability among the faithful. 2. Reverend Clarence LaVaughn Franklin, widely known as C.L. Franklin, was a man of immense charisma and spiritual magnetism, a preacher whose voice carried both fire and silk. He was the father of the legendary Aretha Franklin, but before her fame, he had already carved out his own place in American religious and cultural history. His sermons were legendary, recorded and sold like hit records, and his words reached both the pews of Detroit and the broader nation. Yet beneath the brilliance of his oratory and the power of his pulpit stood a man whose private life was far from the holiness he proclaimed. His name became a paradox, revered and controversial, saint and sinner, both a shepherd and a man haunted by his own vices. C.L. Franklin was known not only for his preaching, but also for his extraordinary charm, which drew crowds and admirers alike. But that same charm led him down darker paths. He engaged in multiple extramarital affairs, many of which became open secrets among those close to him. Most disturbing were reports that he impregnated a 12-year-old girl, a revelation that still shocks those who learn of it today. For a man who preached about morality and divine guidance, this act revealed the depth of his human contradictions. His position of power within the church gave him access authority, and too often that power blurred into exploitation. His struggles extended beyond the moral and into the criminal. C.L. Franklin's home, which once hosted civil rights icons and gospel greats, also became the site of late-night parties rumored to involve drugs, alcohol, and chaos far from the sacredness of the pulpit. His reputation as a ladies' man mixed with whispers of substance abuse and reckless living, making him both admired and feared. At one point, he faced arrest for drug possession and was later accused of tax evasion, tarnishing his name even further. These scandals, coupled with his lifestyle, painted a painful picture of a man who could ignite souls with his preaching yet seemed unable to save his own. 3. Bishop Eddie Long was once a towering figure in the modern black church, a man whose charisma, passion, and presence drew tens of thousands to his ministry at New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta. To many, he was the embodiment of success, a powerful preacher who combined prosperity theology with messages of discipline, leadership, and divine favor. His voice thundered with conviction, and his image as a family man and spiritual father inspired countless followers. Yet, beneath the shining image of triumph and authority lay a story of deep controversy, one that would shake not just his church, but the faith of many who once called him their shepherd. In 2010, the world watched in disbelief as 4 young men came forward, accusing Bishop Long of coercing them into sexual relationships during their teenage years. They described how he allegedly used his influence and wealth to manipulate their trust, showering them with expensive gifts, lavish trips, and financial favors funded through church resources. These were not just accusations of misconduct, but a betrayal from a man who preached purity and integrity. For those who saw him as a father figure, the revelations felt like a wound that pierced through both faith and innocence, challenging the image of the man who once stood as a symbol of moral authority. The lawsuits that followed were settled quietly out of court, with details kept private, leaving behind a cloud of unanswered questions. Bishop Long denied all wrongdoing, insisting on his innocence and portraying himself as the victim of spiritual attack. Yet, the damage was irreversible. His once massive congregation fractured, and his name, once synonymous with power and success, became entangled with whispers of scandal and hypocrisy. For Pastor Kean Henderson, known for his eloquence, charisma, and leadership at the Lighthouse Church in Houston, has long been admired for his ability to connect faith with real-life struggles. His sermons often blend humor, raw honesty, and motivation, drawing in a large following both in person and online. To many, he represents the modern face of the Black church, stylish, relatable, and deeply spiritual. But even those who lead the faithful are not immune to moments that expose their human flaws, and one such incident would bring Pastor Henderson a wave of criticism and controversy that tested his image as a compassionate leader. During a Sunday service, a video captured a tense and uncomfortable moment. A woman in the congregation, visibly emotional and crying, tried to express herself. Instead of comforting her, Pastor Henderson abruptly snapped his fingers at her, signaling for her to stop and regain composure. The gesture, caught on camera, spread rapidly across social media. For many viewers, it felt like a public humiliation, a moment that betrayed the tenderness expected of a shepherd toward a hurting soul. His actions were called insensitive, dismissive, and unbefitting of a man who often preached about grace, empathy, and understanding. 5. Pastor David E. Wilson became the center of an online firestorm when a leaked explicit video surfaced, allegedly showing him in a compromising act that stood in stark contrast to the values he preached from the pulpit. Known in his community for fiery sermons on morality, faithfulness, and Christian discipline, Pastor Wilson's name had long carried an air of authority and righteousness. But the viral footage shattered that image in an instant, leaving his congregation and much of the online faith community grappling with shock, disbelief, and disappointment. What began as an act of private weakness quickly spiraled into a public reckoning that threatened to undo years of spiritual leadership. The video spread rapidly across social media, drawing millions of views within hours. For many, it wasn't just the explicit nature of the content that stung. It was a hypocrisy it seemed to expose. Here was a man who had often spoken about purity and fidelity, suddenly caught in behavior that contradicted everything he claimed to stand for. Church members were divided. Some rushed his defense, citing forgiveness and grace, while others demanded his resignation, arguing that his credibility as a spiritual guide had been permanently compromised. The incident became yet another reminder of how quickly private sins can become public spectacles in the digital age, especially when leaders hold others to standards they themselves fail to uphold. As the scandal unfolded, Pastor Wilson reportedly remained silent at first, perhaps out of shock or embarrassment. The lack of immediate accountability only fueled speculation and anger. For his followers, the pain went beyond disappointment. It felt like betrayal. In smaller churches, the bond between pastor and congregation runs deep, built on trust and shared vulnerability. When that trust is broken, the wound lingers not just in the pews, but in the faith of the people themselves. His silence created a vacuum that social media quickly filled with ridicule, judgment, and endless debate about the authenticity of modern-day preachers. 6.
Narrative that Joseph wanted to put her away privately.
He wants to put her away privately.
Yes.
Right, because the whole
Pastor Jamal Bryant rose to prominence as one of the most dynamic and outspoken figures in the modern black church. With his magnetic delivery, sharp intellect, and ability to fuse social activism with biblical conviction, he quickly became a household name in ministry circles. As the founder of Empowerment Temple in Baltimore and later the senior pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta, his sermons resonated with thousands who saw in him both spiritual fire and cultural relevance. Yet, behind the pulpit's brilliance lay a personal struggle that would test not only his faith, but also his credibility as a man of God. In the midst of his growing fame, Bryant's personal life began to unravel publicly. He admitted to infidelities during his marriage to Gizelle Bryant, a revelation that shook both his congregation and his image as a moral leader. The admission wasn't just whispered gossip. It became a national conversation after he confessed to fathering a child outside of his marriage. DNA tests confirmed the paternity, forcing him to confront the consequences of choices that stood in direct opposition to the values he so passionately preached. For a man who often spoke about integrity, family, and spiritual discipline, the scandal cast a long shadow over his ministry, exposing the painful gap between his message and his humanity. The fallout was immediate and deeply personal. His marriage ended in divorce, and many in his congregation felt disillusioned, unsure of how to reconcile their pastor's failures with the man they had trusted for guidance. Yet, Bryant faces shame with an unusual openness, acknowledging his flaws and expressing remorse for his actions. He often spoke about grace, redemption, and the struggle of being a public figure trying to live out faith in an imperfect world. Still, critics argue that confession did not erase accountability, and that his repeated stumbles revealed a pattern rather than a mistake. The tension between forgiveness and responsibility became the heart of his story. 7.
With your identity, instead of doing like you used to do, I accept my true identity.
Pastor Creflo Dollar has long been one of the most recognizable faces of the prosperity gospel, a theology that ties faith to financial blessing and abundance. As the founder of World Changers Church International in Atlanta, his sermons on wealth, success, and divine favor drew thousands of followers who saw his message as proof that Christianity could embrace both spirituality and success. With his sharp suits, polished charisma, and commanding stage presence, Dollar built a ministry empire that stretched far beyond the pulpit, complete with television broadcasts, international conferences, and a loyal global audience. But his message of prosperity eventually collided with controversy, raising hard questions about greed, faith, and the true meaning of stewardship. In 2015, Pastor Dollar made headlines for all the wrong reasons when he publicly sought $60 million from his followers to purchase a private Gulfstream G650 jet. The campaign, presented as a necessity for global ministry work, ignited outrage both inside and outside the church. Many saw it as an audacious display of excess, a spiritual leader asking ordinary believers, many of whom struggle financially, to fund his luxurious lifestyle. The jet, one of the most expensive private aircraft in the world, became a symbol of the growing divide between modern megachurch leaders and the communities they claim to serve. Critics argued that Dollar's appeal represented the worst form of exploitive fundraising, blurring the line between faith and financial manipulation. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. News outlets ridiculed the request, and social media erupted with anger and disbelief. Defenders of Pastor Dollar argued that his ministry's reach justified the need for such a tool, insisting that the prosperity gospel had always emphasized abundance as a reflection of divine favor. But to many observers, the moment revealed a troubling distortion of that message, a gospel that appeared more concerned with luxury than with love, more invested in comfort than compassion. The controversy forced an uncomfortable reckoning within parts of the faith community about how wealth and faith had become intertwined in ways that risked alienating the very people the church was meant to uplift. 8.
Luke is writing in the...
Bishop T.D. Jakes stands as one of the most influential preachers of his generation, a man whose voice, presence, and message have touched millions around the world. As the founder of the Potter's House in Dallas, his sermons have offered hope to the broken, healing to the wounded, and empowerment to those seeking purpose. His books, films, and conferences have made him not just a pastor, but a global brand, a spiritual icon who bridges faith and success. Yet, as his prominence has grown, so too has the scrutiny surrounding his extraordinary wealth and lifestyle. sparking an ongoing conversation about the cost of success in ministry and the contrast between the preacher's abundance and the struggles of those he serves. Bishop Jakes' lifestyle has often been described as lavish. Reports of multiple mansions, luxury cars, and exclusive vacations have surrounded his name, painting the portrait of a man living far beyond the average means of his congregation. To many observers, the image feels jarring, a shepherd leading a flock that often sacrifices just to give, while living in levels of comfort they can only dream of. His ministry's message of empowerment and prosperity has fueled debates about whether the gospel has become a means to material gain rather than spiritual growth. Critics point to his opulence as a sign of misplaced priorities, arguing that the preacher's wealth stands in painful contrast to the financial hardships faced by the very people who fill his pews and fund his vision. For Bishop Jakes, however, the defense has always been consistent. He insists that his success is a result of hard work, entrepreneurship, and God's favor, not exploitation. He has often reminded the public that much of his income comes not from the church itself, but from best-selling books, film productions, and speaking engagements. Still, even that explanation hasn't silenced the growing discomfort among those who question whether spiritual leaders should live so lavishly while their communities face poverty, debt, and despair. The tension highlights a larger cultural divide within Christianity itself, between those who see prosperity as proof of divine blessing and those who see it as a dangerous distraction from humility and service. 9.
I'm a sinner and I'm asking for your grace.
Deitrick Haddon was once hailed as one of gospel music's brightest stars, a dynamic singer, songwriter, and preacher whose energy and creativity pushed the boundaries of traditional ministry. Known for blending contemporary R&B sounds with powerful spiritual messages, he built a following that admired his honesty and passion. But behind the rhythm and the pulpit fire lay a storm of personal drama that would soon spill into public view, blurring the line between ministry and reality television. His story, filled with both redemption and contradiction, became a mirror reflecting the struggles of fame, faith, and human weakness in the modern church. At the height of his career, Haddon stunned fans when he publicly accused his then-wife, Damita Chandler, of infidelity. His emotional posts on social media painted himself as the heartbroken victim of betrayal, drawing sympathy from many who followed his ministry and music. But as the story unfolded, the truth proved far more complicated. Haddon eventually admitted that during the breakdown of his marriage, he had also engaged in an extramarital relationship, one that resulted in the birth of a child. The confession shifted public perception dramatically, transforming what seemed like righteous outrage into a portrait of hypocrisy. His attempt to expose his wife's alleged sin had only unveiled his own, revealing a tangled web of love, lust, and wounded pride. Instead of keeping the scandal private, Haddon allowed the drama to play out publicly, even weaving parts of his personal turmoil into sermons and interviews. He spoke passionately about grace and forgiveness, framing his downfall as a lesson in transparency and human imperfection. Yet, to many observers, it felt like spectacle rather than repentance. His willingness to turn his personal pain into public content blurred boundaries and left many questioning his motives. Was it confession, or was it performance? The lines between ministry, entertainment, and self-promotion grew ever more blurred, especially as his life became featured on the reality series Preachers of El Dorado, where faith often clashed with fame. 10.
Clapping in your hand and running in your feet and shouting in your soul.
Reverend Henry Lyons was once regarded as one of the most powerful and respected figures in black church leadership. As president of the National Baptist Convention USA, the largest black religious organization in the country, he carried immense influence and represented the voice of millions. Charismatic, eloquent, and politically connected, Lyons embodied the image of a man destined for greatness within the faith. Yet beneath the dignified sermons and polished appearances lay a hunger for wealth and power that would ultimately destroy his reputation and unravel the institution he led. His rise and fall became one of the most notorious scandals in modern church history, a sobering tale of how greed can corrupt even those who once seemed chosen by God. During his tenure as president, Lyons wielded enormous authority over church resources and partnerships. But instead of using that position to uplift his denomination, he used it for personal gain. Investigations revealed that he had embezzled and laundered more than $4 million through fraudulent deals and secret counts. The funds, intended for charitable causes, community programs, and church growth, were instead funneled into luxury purchases, including mansions, jewelry, and high-end cars. It was also discovered that he used some of the stolen money to support extramarital affairs, maintaining an extravagant lifestyle far removed from the humble faith he preached. His betrayal of trust shocked the religious world and left a deep scar on the Baptist community that had once revered him. When the truth came to light, the fallout was swift and devastating. Federal prosecutors accused Lyons of fraud, extortion, and money laundering, painting a vivid picture of a man consumed by greed and deception. In 1999, he was convicted and sentenced to prison, marking a dramatic fall from grace for someone who had once stood at the pinnacle of religious power. Congregations across the nation were left heartbroken and disillusioned, forced to confront not only his wrongdoing, but also the culture of unchecked reverence that allowed it to happen. His story became a painful lesson in how absolute authority, when mixed with ambition, can erode the very soul of ministry. 11.
Passionate
So overcome with love.
and captivating spiritual leader.
And leave you up.
Pastor Carlton Pearson was once a shining star in the Pentecostal world, a man whose voice could fill an arena and whose sermons carried both intellectual depth and emotional fire. As the founder of Higher Dimensions Evangelistic Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, he built one of the largest multicultural congregations in America. His preaching was bold, electrifying, and full of conviction, earning him a seat among the great televangelists of his time. But at the height of his success, Pearson's ministry took a radical turn, one that would cost him nearly everything. What began as a theological revelation would become one of the most polarizing controversies in modern church history. In the early 2000s, Pearson delivered a sermon that stunned the Christian world. He declared that God had shown him a truth, that no one's going to hell. He called it the gospel of inclusion, the belief that all souls, regardless of faith or sin, were ultimately reconciled to God through love. It was a message of radical grace and compassion, but to his Pentecostal peers, it was blasphemy. Church leaders who once embraced him turned away. Denominations revoked his credentials, and many in the evangelical community publicly branded him a heretic. The man who had once been celebrated for his boldness now found himself ostracized, his name spoken with disdain in the very circles that once cheered his rise. The backlash was swift and merciless. His once thriving megachurch, which had drawn thousands weekly, began to empty almost overnight. Members left in disbelief, unable to reconcile his new message with the doctrines they had been taught all their lives. Financial support evaporated, partnerships dissolved, and Carlton Pearson watched as his empire crumbled before his eyes. The stage lights dimmed, the applause faded, and the man who had once filled stadiums now stood nearly alone, exiled for believing that love, not fear, was the true heart of the gospel. Yet even in the face of rejection, Pearson refused to recant. He insisted that his revelation came from God, that humanity's obsession with damnation had overshadowed the message of divine mercy. 12.
So close your eyes and realize this is not imagination.
Pastor John Gray has long been known as a gifted communicator, a man whose humor, passion, and authenticity made him one of the most relatable voices in contemporary ministry. Rising from associate pastor under Joel Osteen at Lakewood Church to leading his own congregation at Relentless Church in South Carolina, Gray built a reputation for blending transparency with spiritual depth. His sermons often spoke about marriage, family, and the challenges of living a godly life in a complicated world. Yet, his own personal journey would become a public spectacle, one that blurred the line between repentance and reputation management, love and luxury. In 2018, Pastor Gray admitted to what he called emotional unfaithfulness in his marriage to his wife, Aventer. Though he denied a physical affair, he confessed to crossing emotional boundaries that betrayed her trust. The revelation came amid swirling rumors of infidelity, leaked recordings, and social media speculation. At a time when he preached integrity and accountability, many saw his admission as both courageous and deeply ironic. A man of God confronting the very sin he had often warned others about. But it wasn't the confession alone that made headlines. It was what came next that fueled widespread outrage and fascination. In an effort to publicly reconcile with his wife, Gray gifted Avenher a $200,000 Lamborghini SUV, presenting it as a token of love and gratitude. To some, the gesture seemed romantic, even redemptive. A husband tried to rebuild trust after failure. But to others, it felt tone-deaf and materialistic, a display of excess that undercut the humility repentance requires. Critics accuse him of trying to buy forgiveness, using wealth and spectacle to smooth over wounds that required something far deeper. The image of a pastor giving such an extravagant gift while many in his congregation faced financial hardship became symbolic of a larger issue within modern ministry. When pastors live like celebrities, their messages of sacrifice and servanthood begin to lose meaning. 13. Bishop Daniel Abinum remains one of Ghana's most polarizing religious figures, a man whose rise to fame was fueled as much by controversy as by charisma. As the head of the International God's Way Church, he commanded massive followings with his theatrical sermons, claims performing miracles, and a larger-than-life persona that blurred the line between spirituality and spectacle. To his devoted members, Abinum was a man of God chosen for supernatural work. To critics, he embodied the dangers of unchecked religious power. His flashy lifestyle, self-proclaimed angelic status, and public dramas made him a constant feature in headlines. But it was one shocking act that ultimately shattered his image and led to his arrest. During a televised church service, Bishop Abinum took it upon himself to discipline 2 teenage congregants who confessed to having premarital sex. In full view of the congregation and cameras, he beat the boy and girl with a belt, claiming he was following divine instruction to correct their sins. The disturbing footage spread across Ghana and beyond, sparking national outrage. What Abinum called spiritual correction was widely condemned as child abuse and humiliation. The video of the terrified teens pleading for mercy became a symbol of how deeply some religious leaders could overstep, confusing control for care and cruelty for correction. Public backlash was immediate. Human rights organizations, child welfare advocates, and even government officials condemned the act, demanding justice for the young victims. Eventually, Bishop Abinum was arrested and charged with assault, a dramatic fall for a man who once declared himself above earthly laws. His supporters claimed persecution, arguing that the bishop was under spiritual attack. But the tide of public opinion had shifted. The image of him being led away by police in handcuffs became one of the most defining moments of his career, a visual reckoning for years of unchecked authority and controversial behavior. 14. Pastor Lamar Whitehead's life has played out like a modern-day parable of greed, glamour, and downfall. Known for his designer suits, luxury cars, and diamond-encrusted accessories, the Brooklyn-based pastor built a brand around prosperity and power. As the flashy leader of Leaders of Tomorrow International Churches, he was often seen flaunting wealth that seemed to defy the humility expected of a man of God. For years, his congregation watched him stride into church draped in Gucci and Louis Vuitton, preaching a gospel that equated divine favor with material success. But behind the image of success was a troubling story of deceit, manipulation, and scandal that would eventually lead to his conviction. Whitehead's troubles began when one of his own parishioners, a devout woman who trusted him deeply, accused him of stealing her life savings, $90,000 meant for her retirement. She claimed that the pastor had promised to help her buy a home, only to take the money and spend it on luxury goods and personal indulgences. When the story broke, it shattered the image of a man who had long presented himself as a shepherd of the faithful. Instead, he was seen as a wolf in designer clothing, using the pulpit not to guide souls but to enrich himself. Prosecutors later charged him with fraud, and after a high-profile trial, Pastor Whitehead was found guilty, his downfall unfolding as dramatically as his rise. Adding to the spectacle, one of the most surreal moments of his public life came when he was robbed at gunpoint during a live-streamed Sunday service. Masked men burst into his Brooklyn church, forcing him and his wife to ground as they stripped him of over $1 million worth of jewelry. The shocking footage went viral, leaving many torn between sympathy and disbelief. Some saw it as a tragic consequence of flaunting excess. Others viewed it as poetic justice, a man who lived by opulence now being humiliated by it. For Whitehead, the robbery only deepened the scrutiny on how a pastor could accumulate such riches while preaching faith and humility. 15. Pastor Tony Smith built his ministry around firebrand preaching that often crossed a line between conviction and cruelty. Known for his unfiltered sermons and unapologetic tone, he cultivated an audience that applauded his no-compromise style while alienating nearly everyone else. From the pulpit, Smith delivered messages that were less about spiritual growth and more about condemnation. His harsh words toward the LGBTQ+ community, other Christian denominations, and even women became his trademark, earning him notoriety rather than respect. What he called truth-telling, many saw as hate speech disguised as holiness. Over time, his sermons would spark outrage, protests, and heated debates about where the boundary lies between preaching the gospel and promoting prejudice. Recordings of Pastor Smith's sermons began to circulate widely on social media, where his mocking tone and inflammatory comments drew national attention. He ridiculed members of the LGBTQ+ community, using slurs and laughter to demean them from the pulpit. He dismissed entire denominations as false churches and mocked women for seeking leadership roles, suggesting that their voices had no place in ministry. To a small circle of loyal followers, Smith's sermons were seen as bold truth in a world of compromise. But to many others, his words reflected intolerance and arrogance, a toxic mix of ego and ignorance cloaked in religious rhetoric. As backlash grew, protesters began appearing outside his church, demanding accountability and compassion. LGBTQ+ advocacy groups called for his sermons to be removed from online platforms, labeling them as incitements to hatred. Even fellow pastors distanced themselves, condemning his rhetoric as divisive and unchristlike. Yet Smith remained defiant, doubling down on his views and claiming persecution. He insisted that he was simply preaching the word, even as his words tore communities apart and deepened wounds within the church.